A very warm welcome to all of you, and especially, of course, to Sandra. Thanks for doing this with us. Sandra Matz is the David W. Zalaznick Associate Professor of Business at the Columbia Business School, and she is, and now I have to concentrate very hard, a computational social scientist, and that means she works and she tries to find out how psychological characteristics influence real-life outcomes in business domains, but also maybe in political domains. And so today we want to talk especially about how political parties can use psychological targeting for campaigns. Hi, Sandra, very, very warm welcome. Thanks for doing this.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So to start off, I got up this morning and I checked my emails first, and I browsed through Instagram, and then I made a coffee. Maybe I made a second coffee. So how much did I reveal about myself in those just few minutes of my early day?
Well, most likely more than you think. And I think this is generally speaking true for any interaction that we have with digital devices these days, right? Most of us think of data when we post on social media, when we use the internet. But there's so many ways in which we interact with technology, right? When you pick up your phone immediately knows that you're not asleep anymore because you unlock it, keeps track of the pages that you visit when you browse Google or the internet more broadly, kind of keeps track of who you text, potentially what you text, knows that there's ambient light, so you're up. I mean, I think what's interesting is that, I mean, you have coffee at home. I typically, the first thing I do in the morning is that I walk my dog, so I leave the house, get a coffee, and there's so many other traces that I leave just by doing that. You have cameras all over that using facial recognition could easily track me down, know that this is me. Like I pay for the coffee with my credit card, leave another footprint of here's something that I'm interested in, review my location using my phone. So I think there's all these traces that are not necessarily top of mind for people, but that we're leaving. And if you put all of them together, it can give you a pretty good sense of what someone's life looks like.
And exactly those data you're trying to use in psychological targeting to develop means of like, how can I target, as it says in the name, especially business ads better to a person than you are having different interests than I am having interests. So what you're seeing on Instagram differs from my Instagram feed. So just quickly to get us started here, what is psychological targeting in a nutshell?
Super happy. What I should say is that I do this from a scientific background, right? So it's not my goal to sell you more toothpaste. It's mostly my goal to show what is feasible and then think about how we might want to regulate this and how we could be using it in different contexts. But so the idea of psychological targeting or psychological profiling is really that we are, instead of giving people questionnaires to understand their motivations, their needs, preferences, concerns, hopes, and fears, we look at their online data. So we look at all of the traces that you leave, and then we can use machine learning to essentially translate all of your digital footprints into a psychological profile that humans can understand and make sense of. And then by knowing your preferences, your motivations, we can then try to influence your behavior, your thoughts, your feelings by tapping into these motivations, right? So if I know, for example, that you're extroverted, that you care a lot about your social relationships, the way that I talk to you, or the things that I suggest to you, Netflix was mentioned before, but true across different contexts, that might very much depend on your extrovertedness and your preferences that are associated with being extroverted.
So it's one thing to use all that to target my Netflix needs or to get me to buy a specific bag on Instagram, but it's a totally different thing than using it as a party to get someone's vote. So how can political parties actually use all of those things you just described to us to target their voters better?
Huge question. And I think there's a couple of different answers, right? I think the first one that I do think is important to start with, because it's on everybody's minds, is that it very much depends on what you use it for, even in the context of political targeting. There's this saying among computer scientists, it's Kranzberg's first law of technology, that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And I think the last part is really the critical one, because it depends on how you use it. It depends on leadership. It depends on the vision that you have for what you're using this for. So the idea behind psychological targeting, I think very nicely fits into this categorization, right? Because at the very basic, psychological targeting is meant to try and understand what you care about and then tap into this motivation. So you can imagine that this can be extremely powerful in a positive way. And I think many politicians, including Hillary Clinton, who then lost the election, they were essentially criticized for not speaking the language of their constituents, for not really trying to understand, to see where the constituents are coming from, speaking their language, resonating with them on a level that is more personal. And in a way, that's what psychological targeting does. It tries to say, well, there's no such thing as the average constituent, right? There's no such thing as one message that you can send, because different people care about different topics. And they also talk about these different topics in a way. We kind of have this in offline conversations all the time, right? If we talk to one another, I quickly get a sense of here's what you're interested in, here's how you talk. So we tailor our communication all the time in offline context. Like nobody talks to a 3-year-old the same way that you talk to your boss, to your mom. So in a way, psychological targeting is essentially replicating this at scale in a way that you can reach millions and thousands of people at the same time. So in a positive sense, I do think psychological targeting can really get us to this point where people care about politics again. So if you look at the US, right, a large part of the population simply didn't even bother to vote in the election when it was Trump up against Hillary Clinton. So it's not just that some people were swayed, it's also that there was just a lot of disengagement of people not engaging in democracy and exercising their right to vote in a free election, which for many people around the world is just a miracle. So I think that's one side, is that you could, to some extent, overcome some of this disengagement, some of this frustration with that politics isn't something that really resonates with me. But then obviously on the flip side, and I think this is what Cambridge Analytica has very nicely demonstrated, is it can obviously also be used to undermine the democratic process. If you come back to the basic definition of psychological targeting, it is trying to tap into your motivation to influence your behavior. And that might mean influencing it in the direction that you would like to go in, but it could also mean kind of discouraging you from voting altogether, voting for a candidate for a purpose that you don't necessarily believe in. And we're just kind of trying to tap into your kind of fears in most cases when this technology gets abused, to get you to do something that you don't want to do. So this is really, I think, if you think about, should we be using this technology, the conversation that we have to have, should we be using it? And to what extent do we make this transparent rather than try to pull the strings behind people's back?
How much of a challenge is that for you as a scientist, trying to get a better understanding of all of that, having exactly this conversation? We talked briefly about Cambridge Analytica and the 2016 election, and after that, especially because Trump won, and it was believed that made a huge impact on voters' behavior. Psychological targeting, and also, of course, was very much like close to, this is like a splintered reality, and it caters to all that we all live into different realities, and the big tech companies all also want us to be in different kind of worlds, and we can stay in our own bubble. And then if parties use psychological targeting to do exactly that, we stay in there. And is that not a means to disengage further from the other people that are around me and from the community? So what is the challenge in that from your work standpoint?
I think that's an excellent question, right? Because to some extent, and I do think if you think about micro-targeting more broadly, that's the biggest danger, the biggest challenge that we have, is that my reality might look entirely different from your reality, right? So I do a lot of research on this concept of shared realities, people seeing the world in the same way. And that has a lot of benefits, because first of all, we relate to one another, but it also creates certainty about us being able to trust in the world and trust the politicians that are driving some of the decisions that we're making inside of countries. So I think that is the biggest problem. And right now, there's just no way of breaking out of that, right? So forget about psychological targeting for a second. For me, there's no way to say, I want to see Google searches, a Facebook newsfeed, news that are tailored to a 50-year-old Republican man in Ohio, right? There's just no way for me to step outside of my own perspective, outside of my own skin, and get a sense of what other people are seeing. And I think in many ways, it really depends on how you set up psychological targeting, because to some extent, you could argue that it is an opportunity for you to look at the argument from the other side, but through your own lens and values that you bring to the table. Let me kind of explain what I mean by this. I think we oftentimes, it's funny because we oftentimes say, well, you should be treating other people like you want to be treated. And in a way that's very kind of egocentric, right? Maybe you should treat other people the way that they want to be treated. And I think just you can also make that argument when it comes to communication. Oftentimes when we try to convince the other side, someone who we disagree with, when it comes to political ideologies, values, what should we be doing with the society that we live in, we oftentimes just impose our own worldview on the other side, and we try to make our argument as watertight as possible. What we know from science that is oftentimes more helpful in getting people to even listen to us in the first place is to try to see the argument from their perspective. So what are some of the values that they care about, and how might that factor in to the way that they think about policies or regulation, right? Like simple examples, like if you care about sustainability, you might care about it because you want to save the planet, you want to save future generations. There might be other people who don't necessarily share the same values, right? But they might be interested in innovation. They might be interested in the somewhat more competitive part. So instead of trying to just impose your values, your worldview on the other side, I do think we can create shared reality, not just by kind of all talking about the same thing, but taking each other's perspectives and then getting the other side to listen and potentially also move in the direction that we want them to move in.
I think it's an interesting point that you just made, because that is probably in the United States right now one of the biggest challenges. And we've been talking about this ever since Trump won in 2016. Did we not listen enough to the other side? Did we not go out enough? It was big criticism about journalism in this country that they didn't go out to the average Joe in Ohio to listen to his or her concerns. And now we also, of course, have an election in Germany coming up where there's a similar conversation about, are we listening to everybody? Are we trying to listen to everybody? Are we trying to listen to people that are fearful what might happen in the future, that might have a different view on things like climate change or economic challenges? So where can maybe psychological targeting be a chance there for parties to reach out to voters that might not be their core constituents, but maybe more on the independent side or more left or right, like more on the sidelines? How can you tap into those constituency and maybe then move the needle towards winning an election?
I think that's a great question. And I do think it has almost two components, right? Because I think the latter part, the influence, how can you reach out and talk to people, potentially convince them to move in a certain direction? I think that's almost the second stage of the process, because what you mentioned in the beginning is the listening part. And for that, we don't necessarily need psychological targeting, but we can still benefit from all of the data that is out there. It's super hard for politicians to go knock door to door and get a sense of like where everybody's coming from, what are their concerns, fears, hopes, dreams. But you do have social media, right? And people talk on social media about what they're concerned. So I think even just as a listening piece of getting a sense of where does the nation stand in terms of the different subgroups and audiences that we have, I think is already hugely beneficial. And I think in the US, it's an interesting debate, right? Because to some extent we should be listening. Should we be giving the stage to some of these different opinions? I think is a different question, but listening, I don't think can ever hurt. And then in terms of reaching out, I think this is really, like, if I had to make recommendations, I would say, like, what's the core message? What is it that you really care about? And how can you think about this core element that you stand for from different perspectives? Why is it that Joe in Ohio should care about sustainability? Why is it that a mom in Manhattan should care about gun laws, right? I think it's really this idea that even if we take the same stance, there might be so many different reasons for why we might be supporting certain regulation, for why we might be supporting a certain politician, and trying to figure that out, I think is just hugely, hugely helpful.
how to make it more practical. How do you in your work collect your data actually to get an idea of how to target certain peoples? And we are all in a world where everybody basically uses social media, but of course, some of us use it more intensely than others. And to go back to Joe in Ohio, he might not be using social media as much as you and I do. So how do you collect your data? Where is your data coming from, online and offline?
That's a great question. So that heavily depends on the study context. Oftentimes, we just run studies that are based in consent, right? So if you've ever worked at a university, there's like an entire process of ethical approval that you have to go through, and people have to be informed about what you're collecting, and they have to be informed about the purposes and how you're using their data. So in many instances, we essentially ask people to give us access to their Facebook profile, to their Twitter profiles, to download some of their Google search histories. And then you can start making these inference and say, here's certain words that people use, and that signals that they're more or less extroverted. Or here's certain things that they like on Facebook that signals that they're more liberal or conservative. And I don't think politicians need to go that far, right? Because the beauty of psychology is that it's in many ways intuitive, and you don't need to necessarily extrapolate to this is an extroverted person. You can simply look at interests, and that's something that companies like Facebook and Google allow you to target based on, right? So you could say we are trying to target single moms who are interested in daycare, or we are trying to target middle-aged men who have an interest in X. And that oftentimes goes a long way, right? So it's not that you necessarily have to have this super holistic profile of someone that says those are their deepest psychological dimensions and traits that they have. Oftentimes, when we think about the essence of psychological targeting, it's trying to understand interests. So, and personality in a way is a proxy to understand these interests. So I think I would start with the message, really, what is it that I want to say? And then you can think of different interest group that you might reach over social media. Sometimes you don't even have to use advertising because you can simply post in different groups. And in an ideal world, right, this grows organically. So if you have a message and you get some people on board, they can then advocate on your behalf and kind of continue and perpetuate the message that you're trying to send, which is like so much more genuine and believable than you're just seeing an ad on Facebook.
That's true. Still, a lot of people might feel that this is a very scary thing, but also it's a reality. It's what's happening. Businesses use it all the time. We talked about how it's getting harder and harder to get people to engage, especially in democratic processes like going to an election, listening to politicians, reading maybe even campaign programs. How can psychological targeting be an exciting thing to use to get people to engage more in what we call democracy?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it has to do with giving people voice and choice, right? So like nobody likes this idea that someone can spy on you, predict all of these intimate traits about you, and then just manipulate your behavior by showing you different ads or different messages. I do think it's a nice way of getting people on board, right? So you can capture their attention by saying, here's a topic that we think you care about. But now let's open the dialogue and let's have this as a two-way street. Because first of all, like we're getting it wrong all the time, right? Like psychological targeting isn't perfect. There's no perfect prediction of who you really are and what you care about. It's our best guess at what it is that your heart might be beating for. But then open it up for conversation, right? So I think there's a lot of websites where you can say, here's just some of the things that I care about. And now let's give you more information on this. So I would never use psychological targeting purely as, here's the only information that I'm going to show you. I would use it as an attention capture to draw people in. And then you have a dialogue, then you have a conversation. And some of that might be based on the predictions that you've made before. But some of it, I think, should also be based on whatever it is that people tell you, right? That's in a way coming back to going from door to door, is you might have a message starting initially a sentence, and then you update as you have a conversation. And oftentimes in psychological targeting, that doesn't happen because it's just you have one prediction and that's what you're going to show people. And I think in politics, more so than in other contexts, it's important that you take this as a starting point and then you turn it into a conversation that you have with people.
Before I move on with all my questions I still have, I of course wanted to let everybody know if someone has a question, of course, you're happy to submit them. I have like half an eye on my cell phone to see if someone submits a question. So we're happy to take questions. If you have any questions, we have a little more time left. So you're just welcome to submit them. While we wait on maybe questions from the audience, Bernie Sanders, for example, was a politician who used psychological targeting, and he was like celebrated for it, and he was very successful using it. Donald Trump probably used it as well, or somebody else used it for his campaign. That was viewed very negatively. Would it be an idea, and that's just like my working theory here, to use psychological targeting also to send different messages out to so if I say I want to get information about the Green Party and how they want to proceed in the election campaign, and I go on their website, might it be even possible in the future that I will get a different set of website than another person? And so to get my attention, as you said, and then go from there, so that we have like kind of like different kind of websites for different kind of target groups?
So it's possible. I think it very much depends on how you implement this, right? Because if you want to track someone across the internet, collect all of their data, such that when they land on your website, automatically you show them a personalized website. For that, you need to crawl a lot of their data. So in terms of the ethics behind it, that might be a bit challenging. But what you can always do is, again, like if someone goes to your website, that means that they already are interested to some extent. And then you can start a conversation and say, look, what we're trying to do is to provide you the information that you need to make the decision and to help you find the information that you're interested in. So either answer a couple of questions, log in with some of your social media profiles, and we're trying to make your experience better. So in this case, I think because someone going to your website already signals interest, I would probably not recommend just using passive targeting, because for that to work, you need a lot of external data to be scraped in the background, and that then becomes quite, or at least a bit unethical. But I think the bigger point, right, is that like people's perception is so different. Like Obama was celebrated for using data in a smart way to connect to his constituents. Bernie Sanders is celebrated. And one of the big things of this psychological targeting that I think is just scary for people is that they suddenly can understand it much better, right? Suddenly it's not just what you like anymore. It's no longer your interest that you drive a certain car, but it kind of touches us at the core of who we are, because that's what people think about personality. So a lot of it just has to do with how we describe it, how we frame it. If you say, well, we're trying to target you based on your interests and we're trying to personalize based on what really matters to you, I do think people have a very different perception than saying, well, we're going to target you based on you being an introvert or you being an agreeable person. Because first of all, immediately puts you in a box, and it makes it sound less fluid in terms of your interests. But it also seems like something that is so core to our identity and not necessarily directly related to politics, even though it is, right? So science, we know that those things are related to the way that we think about different issues, but I don't think that's the public perception.
We talked about ethics a bit. Ethics is probably a big part about all of this, especially I would imagine for politics, it should be playing an even greater role, because I mean, I can return a bag I ordered online, but I cannot return my vote. How much do you talk about the ethics part of your science in your work?
I would say it's maybe 80% of what I do is like thinking about the ethics. And it's also what I enjoy the most in a way, right? Like once we know this is feasible, then the question is like, so what? What do we do with it? And I think you're absolutely right. So a lot of it has to do with the consequences of the decisions that you make, right? And in a way that's reflected in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations in Europe, which say that you can't make automated predictions if they have severe consequences for that person. So if I advertise toothpaste to you and I get it wrong, it doesn't really matter. If I deny your loan based on my prediction being wrong, that's a much bigger issue. So I think a lot of it has to do with context. Again, it's not, the technology is neutral, and a lot of it depends on leadership that's behind it. I do think, and this is something that I've recently become more interested in is essentially this notion of control, right? This notion of control is that we're all trying to give consumers more control. The GDPR, the CCPA in California, they're all about increasing transparency and control on the consumer side, which I think is the intention is great, because the intention says, well, we want to put the consumer in the driver's seat again. I do think it's very difficult to do this in the current ecosystem, because control is a right, but it's also a responsibility. And right now, it's really difficult for people to exercise this responsibility because it's just so complex, right? Our brains evolved in the savannah when we had to make very intimate privacy trade-offs. It didn't evolve to navigate the world of big data, where there's so many different ways in which data can be used now in the future. So I think one of the things that we really have to rethink is, what does control mean, and how do we have an ecosystem, an environment that allows people to exercise it successfully? Because otherwise, my intuition is that it backfires more than it helps.
And we're almost out of time. I have two quick more questions for you before I let you go. And we have time for one more session today. So if you're joining, don't go away. There's one more session coming up after we are done. You're from Germany. We're both from Germany. We've been living in the States now for a long time. I'm back and forth. My impression is that politicians in Germany, or politics in Germany, shy away a bit more from using psychological targeting than in the US. What is your take on that?
I think it's not irrational, honestly, because if you look at people's perception of privacy, of the way the data is being used, the conversation has always been completely different. I still remember when the first Guardian article came out about Ted Cruz using Cambridge Analytica, and I knew that it was going to come out, and this is going to blow up in the US. People are going to be outraged. Nothing. People were like, what a smart use of technology and innovation. So I do think there's differences in the perception of what technology can and cannot do, and should not do. So I don't think it's completely irrational. I do think, however, that a lot of it has to do with communication, how you frame it, right? I think what people in Germany say, well, yeah, I would like to have a conversation that's tailored to my interests with politicians, and I would like to see the stuff that I really care about, instead of just being flooded with a generic message. I think that's totally true for people in Germany as well. So I think a lot of it has to do more with how do you communicate the intention, rather than the technology and methodology that's behind them.
So one last really concrete example, the Green Party recently got quite some attention with a campaign spot that was a song that had, in German we would say, Kirchentag sounds. So it was very unique in its message and they were mocked for it on Twitter, and everybody was laughing about this spot. But was it actually good psychological targeting from the Green Party to a certain constituency?
I mean, that's the problem that you have with the mass media, right? The mass media essentially allows you to, even if you want to target a specific group of people, you just broadcast to everybody. And that, first of all, means that some people get alienated just because it's not for them. And so in a way, this is like the limitation of mass media and the beauty, if you want, of something like that's more micro-targeted, like social media. And what I do think is interesting is that there's these two ways in which you can approach this, right? One is to say, well, we're going to try to find our niche, our target group that we want to reach. And then for each of these target audiences, we have our own specific message that is tailored to what they really care about. The other one, and I think Obama did this beautifully in many ways, is to come up with such a strong, unifying and uniting message that it just overcasts all of the differences that these people have, right? If you have a vision that is so strong that no matter where you stand, people can get behind, I think that is a second path that we haven't even talked about, right? Some is catering to individual preferences. Some of it is just having this vision that unites people and gets everybody on the same page.
Well, that will be a second session right there. For now, thank you so much, Sandra, for taking the time for this interesting conversation. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. So starting at 5 p.m., there's one last session today, and it's Ann-Kathrin Netzig im Gespräch mit Shoshana Zuboff, and they talk about, also in English, democracy under attack, how to tame the big tech companies. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. Bye-bye.